Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. It's Patricia Warby, Alchemy Therapies here. And today I want to talk about a serious subject of addiction and whether that is a matter of willpower. Now, I watched a program last night about Matt Willis, who is an ex-boy band member from the group Busted. And he's now happily married with 3 children, and it's 20 years on since, he was famous, and they're still touring occasionally. And I guess the program was made because he was afraid, and he always lives in fear that he's going to relapse. He's been in rehab multiple times. His wife, who, loves him dearly, is just unable to help him really, because it's not about lack of willpower. And I don't know, do any of you struggle with addiction? Do you have any cravings that you find it difficult to stop? Many people do, and it's sort of hidden under the surface, unless you're an out and out, alcoholic or drug taker. Most people struggle with them quietly, silently. And the program was really a typical BBC program. You can find it on iPlayer. Internationally, I don't know if that's available, but iPlayer is just an online directory of BBC programs, and you can access that. I think you can access it pretty much all over the world. And it was looking at really what he was struggling with, and the answers he was trying to find for himself. And in many ways, it was very similar to a program about Tony Slattery, who is a comedian who was famous for a while on TV, and he struggled with alcohol addiction, and Matt was mostly drink, but it was also drugs as well. And he was describing quite graphically how once he started, he couldn't stop. And that's really the modus operandi really of an addiction, isn't it? That you have a craving that's so bad that you can't actually physically do anything but follow it. And there's very many people who have that issue, and I know even a friend of mine struggling with food addiction, and it's really horrible. And they feel morally inferior, and they feel ashamed of themselves because of that. And really what I think the program was trying to say was that it's not a moral failing, and it's not something that people need to be ashamed about. They need to reach out and get help. However, I did hope for more from the program, as usual. I always do. With the Tony Slattery one, it was exactly the same. You get the sort of the personal story, why they've sort of come to this point in their lives, and the hope they have, which is usually guided by the TV producers to find answers. And it's usually in all the usual places. So because it's a UK-based program, he went to he went to Imperial College London to find out the latest research on what happens in the brain, because fMRI now can show exactly what's happening in the brain during various sort of states. And they isolated one area, which they reckon is a drug target, of course, because most research is driven now by pharmaceutical research money. Even if it's funded via the universities, it's usually, if you follow the money, you'll find pharmaceutical industry not far behind. And so they're looking for a drug target that might switch off the part of the brain that causes this overwhelming craving, the sort of reward center of the brain. So that's the Great White Hope. And then he talked to somebody who was a counselor at a very famous clinic called the Tavistock Clinic. And she was very lovely, and she explained to him, seemingly for the first time, about adverse childhood experiences. It always stuns me, I suppose, because I work in this area, that people don't understand that what happens to you in childhood isn't over as far as your brain is concerned, and actually gets embedded because your brain is still developmentally rewiring itself throughout adolescence. And so messages you receive when you're young do get programmed in as autonomic responses. And she didn't really go into that. And in fact, the main criticism I had of the program was it didn't talk about autonomic or body responses at all. And that's the bit that's missing from this dialogue. So we understand, number one, that addiction is not your fault. I hope nobody listening to this believes it is their fault. It's usually driven by your experience when young that changes the way your brain configures threat or safety, and you don't actually feel safe in your body, and you often feel a bit unhinged. And alcohol or drugs or any addictive substance is actually part of your brain's solution. That's not a good one. It's not one we want to encourage, but at least the program did mention that you have to understand that it's trying to find something that makes you feel better. And temporarily, those substances do calm the nervous system, this fight and flight and sometimes freeze mechanism. Now, I think probably Matt is definitely in a kind of fight and flight freeze scenario, but he's unaware of it because he's always felt like this, so he doesn't know the difference. And just seeing him interacting with other addicts and finding, they're all struggling with the same issues, like really sad stories of broken families, violence, parents who are themselves addicted. You saw some really soul-destroying sadness and fear. These messages are embedded in you, and they create a scenario in your brain that feels like threat is ever present. And the weird thing is, for some people anyway, because the threat when they were growing up was constant, really, they actually have very little memory of that. And so if you ask them, they will say, well, it wasn't great, but I really don't remember much. Now, the amnesia is actually selective for the overwhelming situations they were in. And it's a defense mechanism of the brain to not remember. And so they may dismiss their own pain and dismiss the threat they grew up in, or not want to go there. Like Matt was really, really nervous of going into therapy. And although he did go into group therapy, and he has been on a 12-step rehab sort of program, which sort of gives it over to God and says, give me the strength to, change what I can and let go of the rest, kind of thing. It's not really dealing with the body-based responses. That's what's missing from this dialogue. And that's the bit that I need to teach people about, because when you get a craving, this isn't a decision you're making from your frontal cortex. This is an impulse that's driven autonomically by parts of your nervous system that are very ancient, and they're linked to survival, and they're saying, do this or die. And so you can imagine that that's why cravings are so intense and overwhelming, is because your body literally believes if you don't do this thing, you're going to die. And so you get highly anxious and agitated until you do the thing. And then that sets in motion this reward center problem, where the reward center has got less stimulated by good things in your social environment, and more reward is stimulated by instant gratification. And so the whole network of your brain functioning is affected by these adverse childhood experiences. And the more ACEs you have, the more likely you are to be an addict. So it's worth thinking about how many ACEs are in your background. And when I did the ACE quiz, and I'll put the link in the description, I had 2, which isn't a huge number, but it's more than nothing. And, divorce is one, having a relative incarcerated, having alcohol or addiction in the family, mental health issues in the family. All of these things contribute to this threat sense that your brain is starting to adapt to and believes it is constant and unremitting. And so alcohol and drugs calm that system. And so they make you feel temporarily amazing. And then your reward center starts to fire massively and say, I want more of that. I want more of that, because who wouldn't want to feel great? And then the cycle begins, of course. And so it was explained in the program that adverse childhood experiences make you 7 to 10 times more likely to become an addict. So why didn't it happen for me? Well, it kind of did. I got addicted to overwork, to achieving, to pushing myself. I was very, very, diligent to the point of exhaustion. I can't let things go. I find it very difficult. So I do have an addictive personality. And if I'd been exposed to drink or drugs, I possibly could have become an addict. I think it's possible. But luckily, it didn't occur in my family, and I had very strong drivers the other way because my mum was fair teetotal. She grew up with an alcoholic father, my granddad. Um, well, it was her stepdad actually, and she hated drink. She chose my father because he didn't drink. So I didn't grow up around drink, and the drug angle never really impinged. It sort of was around me, but I was never really tempted. Um, so I was lucky. I was just lucky to escape that. But I became addicted to work instead. And, it's very easy to be down on people who've unfortunately found that solution and then they can't get out of it. We all vary in our addictive capabilities. Some people get addicted to shopping. Some people get addicted to sex. There's the gratification triggers these survival parts of your brain that are very difficult to switch off. And as I've said, adverse childhood experience is just one of the major advances in our understanding. And so I was glad that came up in the program. But they kind of missed the whole impact of that on the autonomic nervous system and why it embeds itself in your body as a permanent threat response. So Matt's going through his life functioning. He's a dad, he's a husband, and then he gets the opportunity to go on tour with a busted reunion, and he relapses because someone offers him cocaine, and he thinks, well, alcohol's my addiction, not drugs particularly. And he finds that it doesn't really matter because his brain responds just the same to both of them. And within weeks, he's completely addicted. Now, he gets himself clean again, which is amazing, and took a lot. But he's always living in fear of relapse. And his wife is clearly traumatized by that, what she's witnessed with him and how much she loves him but can't help him. So my message really today is you need to look at more than just talk therapy and drugs, which were the two options offered during the program by, top experts in the field, London universities and the Tavistock Clinic were saying that we're looking for a drug that will target the reward system. Well, that may or may not help. It may calm the craving, but there are other methods of doing that don't involve drugs, but that was never mentioned. And also, the idea that talking about your past experience can help relieve it. Well, not always, actually. Sometimes it can re-trigger people. We have to learn that the trauma is stored in the body and it's there, ever present, ready to, kind of pop out at inopportune moments and affect everything about you, can create bizarre behaviors. It can stop you achieving in life. It can make your relationships very, very hard indeed. And certainly that's been my experience. The problem is trauma changes your brain to expect less reward socially and get more reward from these temporary quick fixes. That chasing the high becomes the thing that does the job for you. And the more it works, the more embedded it gets. And so it's a very, very difficult one to get out of unless you can calm the body's responses, because that is where the messages are coming from. Now, what wasn't covered in the program was why going on tour was firstly so attractive to him, because it gave him, reward, didn't it? Because people adore you. And you're on a high, you're on a stage, you're performing. Music was very much a way he got out of his childhood. But it's not talked about really how to deal with that on a daily basis when the high isn't there, when people don't adore you and you've just got ordinary life to get on with. And so I really wanted to hear talk about autonomic nervous system freeze response, which is so important. It's the bit of you that kind of shuts down. I mean, it was alluded to in the fact that he said, weirdly, I can't really remember much of my childhood. Now, that's not a surprise to me, because selective amnesia for that which is overwhelming is extremely common. And so people who have these childhoods where maybe a parent was abusive, in his case, it was his stepdad, he lives in terror. He couldn't even look at the house he grew up in. He was with his brother, and it was still evoking the feelings in him, and he had to turn away and walk away. And yet, if you asked him what happened in there, he can't really tell you. He has a few fragments of memory. And that is extremely common, because the part of your brain that's responsible for laying down memories with context is your hippocampus. And it's very, very close to your stress response system in your back brain. And so your memory gets completely distorted. Some people who've had really awful childhoods will largely say, no, it was okay, because they've selectively lost the memories of how bad it truly was. And so to get out of this, my message to people like Matt is you need to get into your bodies and, with a safe other person, explore what you're feeling and how you might soothe that, because that was what he didn't get, particularly when his brother left to go and live with his dad because he wasn't getting on with his stepdad. But his brother was his buffer. And when he lost his buffer, I think that's when everything really went downhill. And of course, he escaped into music and being in a band, because who wouldn't want that when you have this abusive background to go back to? And so it's really not about willpower. It's not about being morally, reprehensible that you can't overcome it. It's because your body's messages of threat are still embedded in you, and they need to be soothed and resolved. And that isn't through talk therapy. You actually have to get into the body and notice what's going on. It's very difficult to describe these kinds of therapies, and they're very new. Well, when I say new, we've probably had them about 30 years, but it takes 20 to 25 years for anything to really embed itself, and it's still not in the medical system. And so you can resolve these problems, and it is simple, and it doesn't take years and years and years of being in therapy. It can actually be done in 3 to 6 months. And I'm proving that over and over again with many, many people. Now, you do have to be cautious. You can't promise a result, and people do have to do some work, and they do have to kind of learn the language of their bodies. But when you're in the right frame of mind and when you're supported, that's when you can really make the change. So if that sounds interesting to you and you want to explore more, I'm going to put some links in the description. If you'd like to comment, do ask me anything. I'd love to know what you think. Give me the thumbs up, because the more thumbs up I get, the better, on my YouTube channel. And I hope you have a great day. And if anybody you know is struggling with addiction, please share. There are answers out there, and they're not drug and they're not talk therapy. There are other ways of dealing with this that are much more effective. All right. Lots of love to everybody. Bye for now. Bye-bye.